Are your AI outputs not great lately? It's because your prompting sucks. Let's make it better. Better prompting, better outputs. Papa AI. Or something. Anyway, all the credit goes to Anthropic actually, because this really came from their update on how to prompt Claude 2.1. So in this update, it talks about how to prompt Claude 2.1 now that it uses RAG for retrieval. But logically, it makes sense in really any instance when you're prompting a large language model. First, let's talk about what it is that most people struggle with regard to large language models. Most of the time, the complaints are that either it forgets what you're talking about or it hallucinates on data that you've fed it that it should have. And really all of it has to do with token usage, how efficient the language model is at using tokens, and how hard it's attempting to preserve tokens. Anyway, so first let's talk about Anthropic's advice. So it says what you need to do is upload your data, upload your documents, and then prompt Claude. So essentially you give it the reference material first. And this makes logical sense because if you do it the other way around, if you prompt it, say, hey, below, I'm going to give you this huge spreadsheet. I want you to extract this data from it. What happens is there is a ton of information between the prompt and your answer. And the more information there is, the more likely the language model is to forget, and you'll lose data. And this isn't just for Claude. Logically, this would work for GPT too. You give the language model the context first. You say, hey, here's a huge table of employee hours, whatever. Then you prompt it and say, okay, refer to that table. And it's a lot easier for the language model to go back to find the information they want using semantic search, less likely to have data lost. Okay, that's great for document retrieval, but what about regular prompting in the chat interface? Well, I think this framework works there too. Here's why. For starters, yes, we now have language models that have token context windows of 128,000, 200,000, but in the chat interface, I don't think they are given access to the whole context window. I think every individual chat instance has its own cap. So that means that you really have to watch the length of your prompt. However, if you have a bunch of information, I think this is still a good way to go. If you look at how the standard language models actually treat the chat interface with regard to prompting, if it loses context because it's too long, it's just going to go for the most recent, most relevant information. So with that in mind, I think the best thing to do is to give the large language model its context first. Like, here's all the data that I need you to have because it's context. Okay. And then prompt it. But when you prompt it, you make sure that it's simple, small requests. Don't give it this long list of, I want you to do this and this and this and this. That is when you start losing data. Instead, one at a time. Now, in the chat window, if you do that too many times, eventually you still end up losing data. But here's the real hack. If you're using the API, especially if you're using the API in something like make.com, if you're not talking about having it create something, instead, if you just wanted to retrieve data, if this is more of an analytical task, then you don't need to include the entire chat history every time you have a request. Literally just include the context information. Like in make, you could use like a router and then have question 1 down one route, question 2 down another route, question 3 down another route, and they don't actually include the entire chat history. Then you can compile all that information and use that in a completely new instance for a new prompt that doesn't have a huge backlog of history so that you don't lose data. Hope that helps. Cheers.